escaped Sapiens.
Can I ask, when you're investigating these sorts of things, what sources do you use? Like, what do you do to pry apart stories of this nature in your own research? So, say for example, you let's focus on the Uyghurs in China. So, if I wanted to do an investigation and I want to see personally, is this a story I can trust? How do I go about doing that? How do I, because there's a flood of information. There are stories every day, and how do I know which ones I can trust? Is there some metric I can use? Is there some set of techniques that you personally use to pry open this sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, you're very familiar with the methodology, Shane. Constant doubt. Nothing but doubt. That's how you proceed. About all of your sources. And then you make tentative, temporary conclusions. So, for example, I've just written an article, about a 6,000-word article on the Uyghur question. Mm-hmm. Basically, what I've concluded, and maybe I'll put this up front, and I think I did in my article as well. My first conclusion is there are reasons for concern. There are reasons for being concerned about what's going on in China, in Xinjiang. Why? Because there's a lot of noise about human rights abuses. And this is a pretty serious case. These charges are pretty damn serious. So if you're a human being and you are intelligent and you want truth to win, you don't blithely accept a particular version. You recognize it could be true. And as long as it could be true, we need to watch out and to investigate and to be very, very careful in how we proceed. So that's number one. But there are some problems about my accepting this narrative that's being pushed at me from some quite respectable sources, but also some really problematic sources. The respectable sources might include the New Yorker. It's got a. I'm not sure they've all come out yet. It's got a 4-part series on the Uyghur situation. The Intercept, which I regard as sometimes a very useful source of anti-establishment critical journalism, but it too, by someone whom I admire, Jeremy Skyhill. They also have a recent article that draws on, this is where it gets a bit worrying, draws on unspecified government documents that have somehow magically come their way. But they had a kind of Ouija. But here are the two or three main factors that worry me. A, the basic convenience of the Ouija story. It's just so convenient for this beating of the drums for war against China that has been getting more and more incessantly louder and louder ever since Trump started his idiotic trade war. I say idiotic because it simply hasn't worked. America has lost billions of dollars as a result of the trade war that Trump initiated against China. So it's an idiotic war, but he started it. And the current administration, with the intelligence community, with the military industrial apparatus in general, seems determined So what a wonderfully convenient thing it is that the Chinese have decided to get very, very tough with the Uyghurs, the Muslim, mainly Muslim. It's a predominantly, I think, 90% Muslim part of China. It's always been part of China, nearly. I mean, back before the 9th century, but somewhere towards the 10th century, a group, an army, a Seljuk Turkish army somehow got lost as it was, I think, fleeing the Persians got lost in this part of China and stayed there. That's the beginning of this tragic history. It's the convenience of it just begins to smell already.
Mm-hmm.
Because two, does it really make sense? Okay, I know that we were inclined to think that the Chinese had done one or two or three rather awful things in their history, particularly under Mao. And
my assumption would be that they're no different to the States. I mean, they're human, right?
Yeah, my presumption as well. Now there's the third consideration. Well, is it possible that they have taken measures which seem pretty disreputable to us, but they had reason to be concerned? Yes. Well, the answer to that is yes. There definitely is a history of extremist jihadist terrorism in Xinjiang, and wherever you have that phenomenon, you can be pretty damn sure, because you know it happens elsewhere, as in Syria, for example. We've just been talking about Syria. You can be pretty damn sure that therefore Western intelligence agencies will be messing about, trying to make things worse for China, because what the West wants is, like it wants in Russia, is to see the complete dismemberment of China. That's never going to happen, but it's what the West salivates about in its sleep. And so there will, there's no doubt about it in my mind. I've been monitoring these kind of things for too long to have any doubt at all that where there's trouble for China, the West will be there trying to make it worse. And so therefore, if I am in Beijing, and I do have a responsibility for the extreme jihadist problem in Xinjiang, it is not totally unlikely that I could be tempted to take some rather dire methods to try and make sure that this doesn't spread. But we're talking about a population of 12 million. 12 million people in a state. Xinjiang has a population of 25 million people. And we're talking about a Muslim population of 12 million. What sensible person is truly going to want to create a simulacrum of the Nazi death camps? Personally, I don't buy it. But of course, all of these things at the end are matters of evidence. They're empirical questions. All right. So what about some of the empirical evidence that we have so far? Well, some of it is total balderdash. So, for example, and there was at least a couple of very good articles in I think the author of one of them was Aaron Mate. I'm trying to remember the name of the site. You probably know the one that I'm reaching for.
No, sorry.
A critical, crowd-funded, investigative journalism site. But anyway, they demonstrate that the sources of information about the scandal of Xinjiang are very small, are very narrow, and highly, highly partisan. There's one guy in particular who is credited with pretty much for the whole story about how supposedly Beijing is trying to force a cut in the Uyghur birth rate. Mm-hmm. Is trying to reduce the Uyghur. This is a big part of the whole Uyghur story. How the Chinese are frightened of this Muslim population, and they're trying to stop Uyghur women having children. Okay. Does it make any sense? Absolutely not. It makes no sense whatsoever, unless you're just listening to the idiot who is spreading this story and being taken seriously by people who should know better, and probably by people who do know better, but for whom the narrative is more important than the truth. Why is it so stupid? Because the Muslim population in Xinjiang increased threefold since the beginning, since the late 20th century and today. Mm-hmm. It's exploded. until quite recently, until about 2010 to 2012.
When did this idea of camps first arise? Is this when was the first this first appearing in the news?
Yeah, I think I do. Right at this moment, I can't dredge the right information up, Shane. I'm sorry about that. I think in my article I do have it, and I'll send you the article. Hopefully I do have reference to when these stories began to appear. But I think I'm going to say around 2011 is when this narrative begins to gain some traction, in the wake of some really awful terrorist instances created by jihadists. There was one terrible thing. I remember I was actually in Hong Kong at the time, teaching for the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and this horrible story in Kunming, a different, I think it's a neighboring province of Xinjiang, and they turned out to be Uyghurs, extremist Muslim Uyghurs, and they just went on to the platforms of the main railway station in Kunming. Very beautiful area, by the way, China. And with knives, just stabbed dozens of totally innocent men, women, and children. Just horrible, horrible, horrible. And there are other things of that kind. So as the terrorist instances begin to accumulate, so do the stories about suppression, state suppression of the. But just talking about the birth rate very quickly. Another part of the big story about Xinjiang is that more and more Han Chinese from other parts of China, the Han is
so the main population,
the dominant ethnicity of China. More and more Hans have been moving into Xinjiang because it has been a growing area of prosperity. It was poor and it still is poor, but it has become much, much, much more prosperous than it used to be, largely because of a big expansion in the cotton industry and a mechanization of the cotton industry. So there wasn't sufficient labor. So a lot of these Han Chinese were imported or came of their own volition. There may have been a mixture of both. I'm not sure about that. And relations between the Uyghurs and the Han have deteriorated as a result. But there has been a decline in the birth rate of both the Han Chinese and the Uyghur population in recent years. Why might that be? Because actually the decline in the birth rate in Xinjiang is much greater by a percentage point, much greater for the Han than for the Uyghurs. Why might that be? Well, because China has invested a huge amount more money than it used to in health services and birth control health.
Family planning, this sort of thing.
All of that. And all ethnicities have taken advantage of this vast improvement in healthcare in Xinjiang.
Is there also an uptick in education and this sort of thing as well? Okay.
Exactly. So you've got greater prosperity, you've got greater healthcare, you've got much better education, you've got much better employment opportunities. What do the Western media want you to know? They want you to know that Beijing has established not death camps, because actually no one is actually claiming that. They are claiming mistreatment. They are claiming forcible detention. Sometimes they are claiming rape and such things. But actually, no, they're not claiming vast loss of life. But just very quickly. But you would need to show vast loss of life if you were to show that Beijing seriously had a depopulation policy for the Muslim population of Western China. And that is very obviously not happening. And I don't think much of the rest of the narrative is happening either, because of the very scarcity of credible sources. Nearly all the sources are highly partisan. They're highly anti-Chinese and very right-wing.
So who benefits from these sort of narratives? So you said the long-term goal is to break apart China, or to, in the case of Ukraine, you want to have access to the markets there. But so in this case, in the short term, who is benefiting most from this sort of narrative? Motivations.
I think you kind of said it, Shane. I think the principal motivation is to keep or to try to weaken the major sources of competition to the United States. China, most obviously, is the single greatest competitor against United States hegemony over the world. I think Russia is actually a relatively weak competitor. All Russia has got is a lot of territory, a lot of mineral wealth that is pretty much untapped. I mean, Russia is deeply underdeveloped. And Russia, is basically dependent on fossil fuel revenues. Russia is in a very disturbing place. Russia has got real problems, but Russia has nukes. Russia has nukes. And also, Russia has got hypersonic nukes. And you would worry, if you were a strategist somewhere in the Pentagon, you might worry that, well, they got nukes. They got these nukes, and they got these hypersonic nukes. They've tested them. They seem to work, and we don't. So if Russia, maybe in alliance with China, was to seize its moment, carpe diem, and to say, well, this is our last chance to take the overweening empire down. We better use it, because they're going to catch up. It'll take a year, take 18 months, maybe 2 years at the most. If I was a strategist in the Pentagon, that would really keep me awake at night. Have we reached the point? Have we beat the drums for war so incessantly, so convincingly? Have we stirred up our populations to a fever pitch of hate and distrust, that if they wanted to, they could use nukes against us? Well, if we don't act now, they will do it. So I would worry. But there don't seem to be many people in the Pentagon that really worry about anything. That does disturb me. But I think I've rather gone off the point. So please, Shane, drag me back to the main point here.
So the main point. So yeah. I wanted to. Well, actually, let's go on to another point, which is sort of closely related. One thing that sort of is confusing to me is most people don't seem to be thinking that often about Russia and China. I mean, in the media today, what seems to be more on people's minds are things like social justice. So you see BLM and you see a lot of talking about transgender bathrooms, things like this. And so the picture you're painting is that the power landscape hasn't changed that much. Traditional groups are still in control. But in my mind, there's this question I have, which is, there are these new groups like Facebook and YouTube and these social media giants, and they make profit in a very different way to the CIA or American governments, right? So they make money off outrage. They make money off clicks and this sort of thing. And so they may push a narrative for no directed reason other than that it makes them money. And so to me, I find it difficult to tease apart, is it true that these stories are put in place by some sort of monolithic force, or is it just that we get outraged when we hear about China taking over the South China Sea, or do you have some way of putting a metric on sort of directed intervention and sort of just this money making machine that is outrage?
Yeah, it's a very good point that you make. I think about how the business model of organizations like Facebook and Twitter and the like, it depends on traffic. And it depends on traffic, because the more people who use your information platform, then the more you can charge advertisers for also coming on board your platform. But even more, as we've learnt since the Cambridge Analytica scandal of 2000 and I guess 2017 was the year that it broke. But these organizations make even more money from their sale of metadata to anyone who can use metadata, usually for advertising purposes or other forms of promotion and marketing, but also probably for political reasons as well. So, so that the business model of these organizations is very troubling, and you could also say that therefore, if there's anything that they can do that would generate more traffic, maybe, for example, by introducing algorithms that somehow encourage or push further or promote further stories that, for example, that generate outrage, then that makes that makes excellent business sense to these organizations, and I don't want to decry that. I think it's likely, it's true, but of course there are different outrages, and this is where it gets a little bit more sinister, because there are some outrages that create much more noise than others, even though when you look at the outrages or the causes of outrage, you see that they don't seem that different to one another. You got the outrage of I'm struggling to come up with suitably comparable examples. I may fail abysmally to do this, but we can get outraged as I actually did say it a little while ago. We can get outraged about the idea that Bashar Assad works with the Russians to hit jihadist and other rebel groups in Syria, and that he imprisons people, he tortures people, he hits hospitals. So we hear a lot about those kind of outrages. But only for a few days are we invited to feel outrage about Israel. Just the last few days, it's been bombing hospitals, it's been bombing clinics, it's been killing children without any terribly good reason, because its military resources are incomparably greater than the pathetic little rockets that Hamas buys in from Iran and from other sources that barely do any damage, and to date have killed, I think, and I'm sorry to say this, and I don't want anyone to be killed, but have killed 20 Israelis as against the 230 or more Palestinians who have been killed. No, we'll be feeling outraged about that for a day or so, but it'll disappear. Why do I know that? Because that's how it always goes. That's how it's always happened. No one will be obliged to actually take meaningful action to stop Israel subjugating the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank. As I say, how do I know that? Because we've been through this cycle several times before in the last 2 decades, so we know how it works.
So being cynical to
sorry.
Is there does that teach us a lesson that we should never apologize? Because if you apologize rather than waiting for the next news cycle to come across, then you're really in trouble. Whereas if you just wait for the next outrage, you can get away with anything, it seems.
No, if you're a propagandist, absolutely don't worry about apologizing. If you're a propagandist, all you're mainly concerned about is, does the change that you are being paid to bring about, does the change happen? If it happens, end of story. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Let's go back. This is relatively an ancient example, but it's one that I still often use in my classes because it's so well documented. It's the pretext for war that was used by the United States way back in 1990, as we were beginning to drum up international support to counter Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. We couldn't do it because no one gave a damn. No one knew anything about Iraq, couldn't care less. They knew even less about Kuwait and cared even less about Kuwait. Why should we go to war with Saddam Hussein over Kuwait? No one gave a shit. So we had to get a bit smarter in our propaganda, and we employed, because public relations agencies, you remember Edward Bernays came up with the term public relations as an alternative to propaganda back in the 1920s. We hired Hill and Knowlton. I say we, I'm talking about, formally, I'm talking about an organization that called itself, I think it was the Friends of American Arab Friends of Kuwait, or some such name as that. They got the funding and they paid out the money, I suppose, to Hill and Knowlton. But the funding was really coming in from other sources. And the story was these wicked Iraqi soldiers. What's the first thing that they do when they hit Kuwait City? Do they go and have a drink? Do they go to the local pleasure house? Do they just sleep? No. The first thing they do, they rush to the hospitals, look for incubators, pull babies out of the incubators, and leave the babies on the stone cold floor to die. That's the story. And that is the story that Hill and Knowlton swung by, first of all, a congressional investigation committee and the so-called testimony coached by the daughter, no one knew at the time, by the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, part of the Kuwaiti royal family, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. She's the only living person who made the claim that she personally had seen this happen. She wasn't even in Kuwait City at the time. There's no evidence she was actually there. But that's the claim that she made, and it was repeated ad nauseum. Every political speech that George Bush Sr. made to the American people at that time made a reference to the putting of the babies out of the incubators. It's brilliant atrocity propaganda. It's truly brilliant, but evil, because it didn't happen. And as soon as the war is over, and no one cared even less about Kuwait than they did before, then investigative journalists began to realize there's no truth whatsoever to this. It's totally fabricated.
And I guess the correction always comes so long after and in small text, and yes. the news story has gone along so that you don't care about this conflict anymore. But it's had its impact.
Exactly.
I suppose that's the key.
That's exactly. I mean, it's an interesting question, though. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that once someone has been found out enough times, that they would then be disqualified from entry into Best Propaganda of the Year award. But it doesn't seem to happen because those voices rarely get to be heard by the mainstream media. The mainstream media didn't rush to tell the world, oops, we got it wrong, terribly sorry about that. And even when it does happen, like after the Iraqi war, so the pretext for war against Iraq, the pretext for the invasion of Iraq back in 2003 was Saddam Hussein has got weapons of mass destruction. Oh, what kind of weapons would those be? People didn't even bother to ask that very fundamental question. Are we talking about nuclear weapons? Are we talking about? It didn't really matter. But the fact that he was claimed to have weapons of mass destruction was enough. And after the war is over,
and everyone's dead.
Well, everyone is dead. We've achieved, according to Bush Jr., apparently mission is accomplished. And that itself was another big, gigantic propaganda hoax, wasn't it? But apparently mission is accomplished, and should it matter anymore? Well, actually, very, very rarely. This very rarely happens. But on this occasion, the lie was so big, the lie crumbled so catastrophically once US troops were actually in Baghdad and in Iraq, that the New York Times and the Washington Post and one or two other big media felt they had to come to the public and say, oh, dreadfully sorry. Dreadfully sorry, but we were listening to the White House, we were listening to the Pentagon, and they were telling us for sure that there were these weapons of mass destruction. And of course, we believe authoritative sources, and you, the reader, has the power to choose. We don't force you to believe anything that we tell you. You have the power to choose, you silly little ignorant reader. So we had that one. I think is the only exception I can think of at the moment, where the mainstream media came and said mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa, and then in the case of the New York Times, within months, I think within less than 6 months, they were playing the same old game. They had said, oh, we're so sorry. We shouldn't have believed this. We should have investigated it further. And, we shouldn't have reported anonymous sources because that's bad, bad, bad. And journalists should never use anonymous sources until they really, really have to. And we're never, ever going to do this again. But yet, a few months later, there's the New York Times, as it still does at least once a month on a regular. It's almost as though it's a religion that you have to do this once a month. You run some almost entirely anonymously sourced story that is totally in the interest of the foreign policy establishment, that has probably been fed word by word to the New York Times by one of the intelligence agencies, and never gets any correction or apology later. And on this occasion, it was a story that Iran was a nuclear threat to the rest of the world. Almost the same story as the Iraq hoax, within a few months of the Iraq hoax being totally discredited in the eyes of the world. And there, the New York Times playing the same old game.
I guess one aspect of this is America does go through regime change. So, I mean, Colin Powell is not there anymore, right? So this might be one aspect that aids in forgiveness, right? The same people that if you go back and you say, oh, look, George Bush did this or so-and-so did that, but they're no longer in power anymore. It's the new faces. So I suppose this might be one aspect why the public is so forgiving of the lies, let's say.
Well, yes, I suppose if one was to look at this, if I was to deal with that question with the attention and care that it totally deserves, I would have to do a case-by-case analysis. I would have to select major political foreign affairs stories and look at how these stories have evolved over time. And then I would have to look at how different media, or in the first place, I would have to look at the positions that the different political parties took on these issues. And then I would have to look at how the mainstream media or different mainstream media also played those stories over time. I think that's what it would take. But because I can't do that just in the space of a minute or two, I'm going to leap to at least a likely case that would caution, be careful, Be very, very careful. So back in the Reagan years, you probably, Shane, I don't know how old you are. I'm not going to ask
No,
you,
no, this is
but
before my time.
before your time, uh, there was a time in the 70s, and it was very strange as I think about it. Intelligent people like you and me were actually asking ourselves the question, well, this silly old Cold War, how long is this going to go on, really? Isn't it likely that both the United States and Russia, they're getting more industrial, they got more or less the same weapons, they're all human beings. Isn't it very likely that after a period of time, it's not going to matter very much? In the United States, we've got pensions, and we've got social security, we've got great healthcare. We care about people. And in Russia, they got some of those same things. So we're getting a little bit more communist, and Russia is getting a little bit more capitalist. Isn't it likely that ultimately the two systems will merge and they will eventually be indistinguishable? And that might have been a potential outcome, but it wasn't the outcome that the neoconservative regime under Ronald Reagan, and then this was a year after the election of Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain. These two together totally because they're both very right wing, not terribly intelligent politicians who are listening far more carefully than they should to the what was then we still call it the Friedmanesque School of Economics, coming out of what was then called and still is called the Chicago School, which is everything neoliberalism is today. Business should not be regulated. You can't regulate business. Our total happiness and welfare and prosperity depends on business being able to do what it damn well wants, wherever it wants, with whomever it wants. That's the only way. That's basically, in a nutshell, that's neoliberalism, and that's the outlook that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan together represented. And the last thing they were going to do was to be friendly to what was still then Soviet Russia. But the American people need to wake up to the dangers. That the American people need to understand that Russia is a real threat. So that our military get the resources that they need in order to do whatever it is eventually they will need, so that the communism will collapse. And it was a total lie. Russia at that time was not a strong and secure economy. We know that. It's very plain now. Even though the CIA didn't recognize that it was already beginning to fall apart, and Gorbachev came to power, and he was in power by the mid-1980s, and he was going to fundamentally change the system. I've talked to Gorbachev personally, and I've got some of his insights about that period of time. They're really, really interesting. But
how was he as an individual?
Let me quickly, because it's very, very important. The Republicans needed to drum up a story about the threat that Russia represented. The CIA was useless. The CIA was saying, no, we got our people there. We're monitoring it very carefully. No, we don't see any threat. What are you talking about? A threat? There's no threat. And this wasn't good enough for the Donald Rumsfelds and the Dick Cheneys who were in the White House at this time already. And I guess Wolfowitz was hanging around in the background as well somewhere. And they were saying, shit, the CIA doesn't want to play this game. What's the matter with them? I know. Let's set up our own intelligence apparatus here in the Department of Defense. And instead of just telling our intelligence operation to go out and examine the facts, no, we're going to tell them, here are the conclusions. Now go and get the evidence. If you don't get the evidence, you're fired. Go get the evidence. What are the conclusions? The conclusion mainly is Soviet Russia is a terrible, terrible threat to American security. Go get the evidence. It's as simple as that. And of course the mainstream media, because they're paid off or because their owners already belong to the elite little club at the top, buy into it hook, line, and sinker, and before you know it, we're back into full scale Cold War again.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask?
Yeah.
So you've sort of piqued my curiosity along one line. So the story you're sort of building is that, in some sense, information is the most valuable thing in the world. But on the other hand, you just wait a week, the news cycles again, and that outrage is gone. That information is no longer of any relevance. So there's like somehow this inherent value and this cheapness to information in the story you're selling. And so that makes me curious when it comes to terrorist organizations. So so far we've been talking about state actors. And so I want to understand, when it comes to ISIS or the Taliban or these sorts of groups, where they cause an explosion in Paris, or they bring down the Twin Towers, or they do some stabbing in some region in China. What do these groups gain from that terror? What is it that they are trying to pull out of a situation which is so horrible locally?
In the international realm, there's very little information that is not instantly politicized. And that's because all nations have foreign policy interests. All nations care more about achievement of their interests than they do about some silly little scruple about truth. No one cares about truth, but people care about perception. So that's the first thing to remember. Second thing, yes, there are terrorist organizations. Of course, that's indisputably the case, and probably there always have been. But it's become more fashionable, and maybe because the empirical reality is that terrorism is now more widespread than it has ever been. Maybe. I'm not going to try to answer that question right now. But one thing that struck me, one big lesson I felt that I learnt during the Algerian War, again, going back to before your time, the Algerian War, but it's very, very important.
Mm-hmm. So this is with France, or
people forget this. So we have Algeria, a very populous, major North African, predominantly Muslim nation, seeks independence from its imperialist owner, France. France is not going to give in, not easily. So we have a terrible, terrible period, don't we, where the French are fighting each other over the issue of how long, what degree of horror do we need to perpetrate against the Algerians to try to keep them in line? Eventually, of course, they give, and part of the reason for their concern is because the predominant movement for independence in Algeria is a socialist movement. This is often forgotten. It matters.
Could you put a year on this? Sorry.
Yes, with the let's.
Is this late, like 98, 97?
We're talking about the de Gaulle years, aren't we? We're talking. So this is some time back.
Oh, okay. So
we are going back quite a ways in time. We're going back to 1970s.
Okay. So this is further than that. So I was wondering if this was related to the bombings in Paris, sort of in the 95.
No, that's a little bit later. But we do have numerous terrorist instances caused by Algerian independence fighters. And first of all, I want to explain why the French were so reluctant to do what surely in their heart of hearts knew was the right thing to do, to make peace with Algeria on a fraternal basis, so as to maintain good brotherly relations. That was a sensible thing to do. Britain was doing it. It wasn't as though there wasn't a model for doing this. We'd already given up India. The Brits, I mean. But no, the French were worried about socialism. So when eventually Algeria becomes independent, it's fiercely socialist and is also favorable. It's very Muslim, and there are Islamic groups within the political sphere who wield considerable influence. Ultimately, and now you're asking me about years, I'm going to say sometime in the 1980s, and we're getting to the lesson I really wanted to draw. Ultimately, we have free and open elections. Big but guarded applause by the lovers of freedom and democracy, like the United States and Great Britain and France. Oh, democracy in action. Who wins the election? The extremist Islamic Party. Ah, horror, horror, horror. Oh my God. We can't allow this to happen. We deliberately and directly go back to the preceding political establishment and say, you cannot recognize this election as legitimate. We will fight you tooth and nail if you dare call these elections legitimate. So the elections are declared illegitimate. Of course, the Islamic Party now becomes immensely more popular than it has ever been. And the most horrible, until ISIS came along, you could not imagine the horror that unfolded across Algeria as village after village after village is raped, terrorized, murdered, burnt to the ground as one faction fights another. And in all of this, subsequent events reveal some of what was really going on the ground. You have powerful factions in Algiers related to the Algerian army and intelligence services who are playing their own little games in the midst of this horrible war, for not just for sectional reasons, but sometimes just for their own personal gain. The seizure of land, for example, by top-ranking military. In these wars, it can be, here's my point, in these wars, it can be incredibly difficult, to determine whose interest is really at play here. It's very difficult to see. And that's how Syria seemed for the first few years. People couldn't make head or tail of it. They couldn't see, as they later did see, because it was palpably obvious, ultimately, that Qatar was pouring money into the Muslim Brotherhood, which was behind a good part of the rebel movement. Certainly once the socialists were killed off, or certainly once the pure Democrats were killed off, and they were killed off pretty quickly. So the Muslim Brotherhood, as it always does in Syria, see, the Muslim Brotherhood had already staged a horrible revolt against Bashar Assad's father. Can't remember his first name at the moment. In the 1980s, they assassinated police, they assassinated soldiers. They were as provocative as it is possible to be against the socialist regime, Assad regime. A particular kind of socialism, of course, which is nationalist and which stands for Arab nationalism, standard socialism and Arab nationalism and sovereignty. And the Muslim Brotherhood didn't. The Muslim Brotherhood doesn't respect any of those things. And so,
I suppose they were also the organization that was most ready to take advantage of a coup or
here's the point.
A messy situation.
These are the guys who take power in Algeria, and the West gets rid of. These are the guys who actually, for a few months, take power in Egypt. They're shoved out, replaced by the Egyptian military again. The narrative. I've written about this in relation to the esteemed Sunday Times journalist Marie Colvin. So she, amongst many of her colleagues, was telling this simple little story about pure Democrats, democracy lovers, rising up against Bashar Assad and his regime, so that Syria could be like a West European democratic
Mhm.
sovereign nation is total rubbish. It's a total misunderstanding and misreading of the Arab world in general and of
So
Arab
can I can,
politics in
can I
general.
stop you to ask a
Yes.
question very
Yeah, yeah.
quickly? So you said I might have misheard you. There was this say socialist group that was originally on the ground, and they were killed off very quickly. But that's the narrative that continues in the
There
West.
are competing
Is
narratives, and all I can, I have a book manuscript. The editors are incredibly skittish about anything. They're British editors. They're even more skittish about anything to do with Syria at the moment, because the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has a particular narrative it wants everybody to tell about Syria. I'm not saying I know what the narrative is, but I do know what some of the narratives are, and I do know that they conflict, and I do know that the empirical evidence for the different narratives conflicts as well. Can truth conflict with itself? I don't know, but evidence can. And that's the nearest we can hope to get when we're in the truth business. So you've got quite strong sources that will tell you, yes, this is the uprising in Syria in 2011 is yet another outbreak of the Arab Spring.
but so how does this tie back to terrorist actions?
Because terrorism feeds on funds. You can't wage war without funds. And you rarely wage war successfully unless your funders have a lot of money. So that's why most of the groups, the militia in Syria, were funded either by Qatar or by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Qatar had different ideas as to which were the better jihadists to fund. Qatar went for the Muslim Brotherhood. Saudi Arabia, of course, went for kind of more Wahhabist groups that were somewhat more similar to ISIS, as it turned out. You've got Western intelligence, you've got the CIA running weapons from the failed state of Libya, which the CIA and NATO helped to destroy the year before. Now you've got the whole country is awash with sophisticated weaponry that disseminated up into Turkey, because Turkey is also funding jihadist militia in northern Syria, and Turkey is keeping its border open for the flow of both weapons and of personnel to the jihadist movements in Syria, and also allowing jihadists back into Syria to establish their political bases for purposes of rest and recuperation. Another big player has changed its tune just recently, but was the United Arab Emirates. And as I say, I mentioned the CIA, but you've also got Britain, of course. You've got Britain big time. Britain is behind, for example, the White Helmets. You've got the ex-military British ex-military character Le Mesurier, who is working with a so-called non-government organization called ARC, which is funded by the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and he sets up the White Helmets. And the White Helmet.
These are the groups that are going. I thought these were medical groups that are going in and pulling people out of buildings.
Well,
this is what they're sold as.
That's how they are sold, and there's no reason to believe that some of the time they are not doing that. But the problem is they seem to operate only in jihadist controlled areas, and they seem to do so not just with the tolerance of the jihadist groups, but also in interaction with the jihadists. So you've got members of jihadist militia working with the White Helmets, and you've got White Helmets who seem to move across quite easily into the militia groups. And also the White Helmets plays a part in providing so-called evidence and witnesses to investigations into alleged chemical weapons attacks. And unfortunately, some of the stories get way more sinister than anything that I've cared to mention up until this point in the conversation. Don't take my word for it. I can certainly send you separately sources of information that you can look to see where these narratives are coming from, because that's what's important in the first instance. You're trying to assess what weight should you give to these competing narratives. That's your task. I can't do that for you. I've done it for myself, but with varying degrees of conclusiveness or inconclusiveness. All I can say is that, just as I said with the Uyghurs, but moving in the opposite direction, there are real grounds for concern.
So I want to get back to the question that there's still aspects of this question that I don't understand. So that is okay. So ISIS is doing propaganda when it lines up 30 people in orange jumpsuit and it starts slicing necks and doing horrible other things. I want to understand. Do these activities have direct impact on the flow of money? So, for example, I'm just going to throw out ideas.
Yes.
So, for example, if money is flowing towards terrorist groups, are there choices on which terrorist group to back based on what is the monetary gain directly from?
There's no doubt about this. We got plenty of evidence from the ground. People directly involved who say, well, we weren't getting enough funding from this source. We weren't getting enough weapons. We're being slaughtered. For Christ's sake, someone help us. We went over there. They had better resources. They were going to give us greater autonomy to do what we think is necessary on the ground. We went with them. This is a more jihadist group, so we overnight we got more religious because we had to demonstrate our pro-Islamist credentials even more convincingly, so as to merit, to deserve this better source of money. So yes, money plays all kinds of,
and I suppose
roles.
Recruits as well.
Yes, exactly.
So I want to pull the conversation all the way back to maybe an hour ago, when we're talking about distraction, and I want to just ask a few questions about the Trump campaign and Trump in office.
Right.
So one thing that was characteristic of his presidency was that there was just continuous outrage. Every week there was a new story. I don't know whether that was always generated by him or his opposition and the media. But one thing I want to understand is, was this to some extent intentional on the part of his office so that they could move in policy in the background while everyone was looking at Melania wearing something or him throwing goldfish food into the pond in the wrong way, or whatever the moment was that got people's attention?
That's a great question. Because I've had privileged access to a work that I hugely admire and strongly recommend it to anyone who is interested in these issues, but it's not published yet. I don't know why. I worry about the why. But it's a work by the celebrated expert on Russia, Richard Sakwa, about Russiagate. And he's certainly done more than enough to convince or to raise very grave doubts in my mind about the conduct of both the Mueller report, but before the Mueller report, the conduct of the FBI investigation into Russiagate, which was called the Crossfire. The Crossfire investigation that was initiated by FBI Director James Comey somewhere during 2016. Now, if I follow the Sakwa logic, or here's my interpretation, because Sakwa is very nuanced in how he uses the evidence that he accesses. But my interpretation of the evidence that he presents is that by January 2017, James Comey, if he had an IQ above 10, knew that Russiagate was a hoax. But he kept it going anyway. He kept Crossfire going for a few months more. He got his buddy, a prior director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, also part of the FBI gang, gets him appointed as the head of the inquiry, the so-called Mueller inquiry. And you would have thought, wouldn't you, if we're talking about the possibility that an active president of the United States may actually be a Russian agent answerable to Putin, no less. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that under those circumstances you would pull out the stops to get to the truth, as you would do whatever it took, because someone like that can only do American national security the greatest possible harm. So you have to act with the utmost speed. But of course that doesn't happen. The Mueller report drags on and on and on and on to, I hope I'm remembering correctly, 2019. We're almost into the next election round.
I guess just before coronavirus kicks off, right?
Yes. So the implication, therefore, being, did Comey and Mueller, knowing that there's no there in Russiagate, the best that Mueller actually can do, really, apart from indicting some Russians who, to his great surprise and bewilderment, some of them actually decide to come to the United States and defend themselves successfully against the charges. So much so that ultimately, I think it's the Department of Defense says to those who are pushing these stories about the internet press agency and its associated businesses in Russia, it actually says, stop it. Stop it. There's no evidence. So you've got to presume, for that and for many, many, many other reasons, that Comey and Mueller pushed it for as long as they could to make sure that the mainstream media would have some silly little scandal to break with next weekend to keep the punters flocking.
But so was that okay? So I want to get a picture of now which side is playing here. So was the idea here to paralyze the president's office, that the president's office has to focus on defending itself, and then wasn't able to be active in various ways? Right. Was that the main intention, or was it the main intention to generate scandal in the media? In your impression,
right. So far, Shane, believe it or not, so far I've really tried very hard to remain empirically based. I've tried as hard as I'm capable of, although sometimes I have my moments of weaknesses or my passions take over. But I do try very hard not to say things that I'm pretty sure I can support empirically.
So I'm pushing you in a direction maybe that you don't want to.
No. Now we're just moving into a broad area of speculation, or it is for me at least. It's a very, very good question. Am I capable of answering it? Why did the FBI? Why did Mueller? Why did the Democratic Party not let up? Why did they not let up in all this time? I think it's because, as I said before, I see the FBI and the military intelligence apparatus as a whole being much more in the pocket of the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. That's odd, it's ironic, it's strange, it's curious, but that's how I believe it is. So here we had a lineup. We had FBI, Democratic Party. They hate Trump. They hate everything. Not for the reasons that you or I might hate Trump. I might hate Trump because he's so bloody stupid on the things that most matter. The things that most matter to human beings, climate change. The things that most matter to human beings, poverty, gross inequalities of wealth and the abuses that follow from that. The things that matter to most people are stupid wars. But no, that's not what the Democratic Party is concerned about. The Democratic Party has got nothing to say on climate change in these years when it comes to being critical of Trump. The Democratic Party has got nothing to say about inequalities of wealth, or even, I look at a more local scandal we have here. Homelessness in Los Angeles. Thousands upon thousands of people living on the streets. It's shameful. There are no words for it. So why doesn't the Democratic Party zero in on abuses of that scale and of that intensity? No, all they want to talk about is Russiagate. Even though, as time goes on, the evidence gets slimmer and slimmer and more inconsequential. Even though supposedly, we're talking about a president who is in the pocket of Vladimir Putin, a president who does everything he can to show that he's not pro-Putin, that he's anti-Russia, and he can be as anti-Russian as the next guy when it comes to imposing needless sanctions on Russian politicians or Russian companies. He can be as anti-Russian as they come when it comes to destroying international treaties on nuclear weapons that have kept our generation from total slaughter up until today. No, Democratic Party's got nothing to say about those things.
But so, okay, that's on the side of the Democratic Party. But so on the side of the Republican Party or Trump's party, these scandals that were often in the media that were caused by Trump, or at least were highlighted that Trump had done. In your view, were any of these orchestrated on behalf of Trump in an effort to distract from things that were going on in his own office? As opposed to this Russiagate scandal, I'm talking more small scale things like. There are so many of them to mention, but so the smaller scandals that happened week on week.
Yeah. Yes, I haven't looked. I'm aware of that kind of constant succession. I think your thinking is quite sensible. These could have been politically motivated attempts to endorse Trump amongst his supporters and to try to take some of the political edge away from the Democrats' Russiagate advantage. So an example of that is Ukraine Gate. So the Trump party hits back at the Democrats, not unreasonably, by the way, by saying that, for everything that you say makes it look as though Trump is close to Russia, it looks as though actually the Democratic Party and Joe Biden is way closer to Ukraine than Trump was ever close to Russia. Okay, well, that's a whole nother. And you got this interesting issue actually. This is very remarkable. Paul Manafort, one of the few people who actually suffered as a result, one of the only Americans, I think, who actually suffered significantly. One or two people suffered far less punitive damage, but Paul Manafort, spent some years in jail and lost a great deal of money as a result of Mueller. And and Mueller claimed, and his detractors claimed that Paul Manafort, he was pro-Russian, and therefore he has to be guilty in some way in this Russiagate narrative. The very interesting thing about Paul Manafort, and I'm not excusing any of the financial shenanigans that he may or may not have gotten up to. But the interesting thing about Paul Manafort, yes, he actually did work because he's basically a publicist. He did work, and he's an election meddler, if you will. He's the kind of guy that you go to for advice about how to win an election. So he is an advisor to the Party of Regions in Ukraine and an advisor to Yanukovych. What is one of the most important policies that Paul Manafort, the supposed anti-Russian, what was one of the most important policies that Paul Manafort was pushing to Yanukovych? Here it is. You got to swing Ukraine back to Europe. or not that it was ever in Europe, but you got to swing it to Europe. And how are you going to? You're gonna sign the agreement with the European Union, and that would also set you well on the way to becoming a full-scale member of NATO. That was the game that Paul Manafort was playing with Yanukovych. But Yanukovych, for reasons that we don't entirely understand, changes his mind at the last moment. Yanukovych, by the way, had never been particularly pro-Russian. He wasn't particularly pro. Putin didn't even like Yanukovych that much. I think the reason that Yanukovych finally changed his mind and didn't accept the advice that he was getting from Paul Manafort on behalf of U.S. finance was because the Russians, who are actually incredibly intelligent sometimes, gave him a better deal. And he realized, gee, if I sign up with Europe, there are all kinds of conditions that are coming with this. And Russia is not asking me for anything different to what is already the case. I'll stick with Russia for the time being. I think that was quite a smart move, but not smart enough. Otherwise, I guess he would still be there. But as I say, back to your question. Yes, of course, there are all kinds of games being played all of the time by both of our political parties, and there's a lot of mud to throw around. But I think Russiagate is all mud. I think Ukrainegate, there's some mud, and I'm also inclined to think there is also some truth as well, because the ties between the Democrats and Ukraine are pretty damn strong. And also, there are actually some interesting ties between the Democrats and Russia as well, or certain Russian oligarch. You'd always find a Russian oligarch who's going, or a Ukrainian oligarch who's going to support something. If you're looking for money, you don't stop at borders. You take money from any oligarch, wherever they are. If they're offering you money, you don't necessarily accept it at the end of the day if you're careful. But now the United States has abandoned any real pretense of regulating election finance. We got one or two rules that kind of look sensible on paper, but basically it's anything goes. You can take money from anywhere, through any channel, any country. It doesn't matter. You'll never really be found out for sure. That's the election system. This is supposedly democracy at work. And of course, a number of other countries have realized that's not democracy. That doesn't make any sense at all in any theory of democracy that's ever been heard on the planet up until this date in time. And those countries are drawing their own conclusions about the supposed attractiveness of Western democracy.
So on the topic of democracy, so obviously, if everyone agrees, it's very easy to have a democracy.
Not so easy. I just read the wonderful book. I actually have it here on my desk by John Gazvinian, America and Iran, and he tells the story early on in this beautiful narrative. Strongly recommended, by the way. He's an American Iranian. He tells the forgotten story about the first democratic system that appeared in Iran. The first parliament was set up under the kind of guardianship of the Shah in, I believe it's 1905. But by the time we get to about 1911, and we have, I think it's either the second or the third parliament. The Shah is now just a young kid who doesn't have any real power. The country is being invaded by Russia from the north, by Britain from the south. The parliament are desperate for help. And they cry out to the United States, oh, please, please, America, you understand democracy. You love democracy. You love Democrats. Please come and help us. Please, please, please. Washington looks at the letter that it gets from the head of the parliament, and they just laugh. They just laugh. And so, you know, that's part of this incredibly tragic narrative of Iran, the way in which the United States and Britain overthrew a democratically elected regime in 1953. And then, of course, they mess about in the 1979 overthrow of the Shah by Khomeini. And if anything, do their best to make sure that, well, if we have to live with this revolution, it bloody well better not be a socialist revolution. So it's better to have a religious nutter than socialists. And now, of course, John Gazvinian tells us, oh yeah, and there was that moment in 1911 when America, democratic America, could have stepped in and told Russia and told Britain where to get off. But they didn't. They even laughed at the request from this silly little country, not so little, of course, this silly little Muslim country from far, far away that we actually can't find on any of our most proximate maps. So again, the nature of Western democracy, democracy has got very little to do with it. It's all about the games that we play to secure the perception by the majority of the people that somehow we are legitimate. We have a legitimate right to the wealth that we have. Most of us are millionaires. To the wealth that we have, the games that we play overseas, the friends that we make amongst the most dreadful dictators, and everything we do to keep the American worker, man or woman, in his and her place. And that place isn't a very good place, and it's gotten worse and worse since the 1950s and 1960s, because in those years we were still trying to reward people for their support, for giving their lives in World War II. So they deserved a few peanuts. But since then, people have forgotten about World War II. So now we just screw them. We just screw them in the name of democracy.
So can you have a democracy with the level of misinformation, disinformation that's currently in the media?
It's very, very difficult. But the disinformation starts in the language of hypocrisy. So everything that is said in authoritative circles about anything to do with foreign policy is steeped in the most odious, vomit-making hypocrisy. So anything that Biden has to say about the current crisis in Israel is steeped in the hypocritical presumption that, oh, these are two fairly equal groups. They're having this silly little squabble out there in the silly old Middle East. They're totally equal. Dear old Uncle Sam needs to step in and show these people what the sensible solutions are. We don't talk about the billions of dollars that we fund to Israel each year for armaments. We don't talk about the fact that the United Nations has just declared Israel to be an apartheid state. We don't talk about the fact that the Israelis occupy Palestine, or when they're not occupying it with their own troops, they're making sure that the people of Gaza, the people of the West Bank, have no power whatsoever in the international realm. They don't even have, they don't have the freedom of movement. They don't have the right to uses of their own water in Palestinian maritime water on the Mediterranean coastline of Palestine. They barely have the right to fish without being bombed by Israeli torpedoes. So America will say nothing. How can you have a sensible conversation that cannot, in its very existential nature, cannot speak truth? You cannot have a discourse which is totally alien to truth that can speak truth. That's it. Mm-hmm. That's why democracy and hypocrisy of this scale are irreconcilable, I'm afraid.
One thing I want to ask about is, so it seems like in the current population, there is growing distrust when it comes to authority. So, for example, you see on the Democratic side, let's say, that there's a distrust of police. with the Black Lives Matter movements. And I guess on the other side, there's distrust when it comes to social welfare and these sorts of authority. And at the same time, I don't know whether this is something that's really happening or it's just perceived, but there seems to be this growing incidence of conspiracy. So, for example, just a couple of years ago, if I mentioned, for example, anti-vaxxers, the average person would think that an anti-vaxxer is stupid. But now I personally know people who are anti-vax with regards to the coronavirus vaccine. And conspiracy theories are also, in some sense, they're bipartisan. You'll speak to anyone and they will say it's always the other side that's anti-science, for example. But you'll see that maybe Republicans will be deniers when it comes to climate change. Maybe Democrats will be anti-GMO. Anti-vax is spread across both parties. And so I want to understand, is this something that's being this anti-authoritarianism on both sides, is this something that, is this the public recognizing that there are games being played, or is this itself a symptom of is this something that pressure groups that hold power want to occur in the population, or is it something they don't want to have happen? I can't really. It's difficult for me to gauge. No, I know it's a difficult question.
Of course, we have to ask the question, and I don't think I'm capable of any more of a sensible answer than you're capable of, Shane. I very much doubt if I am. We can ask the question. We can note there are there's a lot of stuff out there that just seems weird, but even more worrying than that, it just doesn't seem to be based in any evidence that we as scientists would recognize, or at least we as people who believe in the importance of empirical facts to support claims. So and there's a lot of that kind of stuff going around. What sense should we make of it? What are the implications of that for example, for the political process? Does it, for example, suggest that the Republican Party now has learned how to politicize conspiracy theories so as to improve its chances of success in the next election? The politicians don't have to believe the conspiracy theory. I mean, they may do, but that's beside the point. It's picking up on things that you think will help you win elections, and that's very, to me, that's steeped in post-World War II belief in democracy. This is very disturbing. And then then I have to, not only do I have to deal with some of that, but I have to deal with the fact, I have to live with the fact that some so-called conspiracy theories, which I happen to believe there's extremely good evidence to support, but which many other people don't, and which if I make a claim to, or if I am seen to support, I will alienate some of my listeners whom I really, really would not want to alienate. So in
other words, it's dangerous to say you believe that a conspiracy theory is real because you'll be seen as a...
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please continue your thought, Shane. Please, yeah.
So you're saying that there is... Could you give me an example? Maybe you don't want to give me an example.
I can give one example because it's just such a well-known example. That it's very obvious to most people, most intelligent people, what the problem is. So it's the JFK assassination. Is it one loony guy who is responsible for the killing of John F. Kennedy in 1963, or was it the major other alternative narrative for which I believe there is considerable support, or was it a conspiracy by by the intelligence community of the United States in alliance with certain other political groups, including the anti-Cuban, or rather the anti-Castro Cuban population in Miami and maybe one or two other groups, was it to make sure that Kennedy would have no chance whatsoever to fulfill the promise of his commencement speech at Washington. I'm going to say Washington University, but I may be mistaken in as to which university it was, just a few months before his assassination. What is it that he says in that speech? He says, we don't believe in communism, but you know what? Russians are human beings. Actually, Russians have done some pretty good things. They pretty much won the Second World War for us. They sacrificed millions of their lives. We just sacrificed a few thousand. At immense suffering and cost to the Russian nation. Russians breathe the same air as we do. We live in perilous times. We almost went to war using nuclear weapons. We don't want this to happen again. We cannot allow this to happen again. Human to human, we cannot allow this to happen again. Okay, what is the implication? The implication is we have to learn to tolerate one another, to live on this same planet, to make what we can of this joint ownership of this planet. That's the Kennedy argument in essence. There's more to it. Here's a beautiful, beautiful speech, by the way. And within the same framework, we know that Kennedy was already clearly grasping to make sure that the stupid US intervention in Vietnam should be put to an end as soon as possible. So, but that's just speculation. Then you go into a whole 50, 60 years of controversy over various sets of empirical information to support the various narratives that exist as to why Kennedy was killed in November. That's a conspiracy theory. You have to pick your fights. That is a conspiracy theory that on other platforms, I would stand up and I would say, I defend this. It ain't conspiracy. It's information. It's evidence. It's fact. And also, it's very much in the character of how America plays its games. I'll stand up.
And then there are others that maybe you would decide it is not the trench you're going to die in.
I'm definitely not going to die in the anti-vaxxer trench, and I'm definitely not going to die in any COVID trench. And I regret the fact that some friends have decided to pitch their tents on some of those fields because it's way too soon. Yeah, be selective. Choose carefully.
But okay, so there are conspiracies, for example, that you may believe are worth listening to, but that you recognize it's not worthwhile being viewed as someone who believes in that conspiracy.
If I think it's true, I'll probably stand for it. But some of these issues are so bloody complicated, truly do require someone who is scientifically has the appropriate scientific credentials. I'll steer clear of it because I just don't trust my capacity to make a judgment. I don't trust my capacity to make a judgment even on things I'm supposedly expert on. But there are times when I think I have to take a stand, because not to take a stand is to actually implicitly endorse an even worse falsehood.
I guess in your research, for decades now, you've been looking at sort of actual conspiracies committed by a government. And I suppose after some decades of that, it's hard not to be a little bit cynical with regards to the way that the world works.
No, I didn't. I certainly didn't start off. In fact, I I think I'll go so far as to say I am not an expert on conspiracy. I'm not interested actually in conspiracy theories.
No, that's not what I've meant.
No.
Of course,
Yeah.
I meant if that's not what I meant. What I meant to say is that when you study governments and you look at the way that governments interact with each other behind the scenes, I am sure you come across situations where you lose faith in your own government, and that's what I meant.
Okay.
And
Okay.
no, I'm not saying that you spend your time researching conspiracies. Far from it. I'm simply stating that
Thank you.
it must be difficult not to become a little bit cynical when you see governments doing things that you might think of as being disgusting, time and time again.
Yeah, I think this is true. I think I come, but I think other scholars from in other parts of the world might look across to me and say, Boyd-Barrett, why did it take you so long to grow up, for Christ's sake? We knew this when we were sucking milk at our mother's breast. Scholars in the South, scholars in the former colonies might very well say that to me. Where were you all these years before you began to add your voice to what is so patently the case, namely that countries, the elites of countries, look after their own interests. They exploit their political systems to achieve their objectives, and they tell stories about what they're doing, so that innocent little people like you, Oliver Boyd-Barrett, will believe them for the best part of their lives, so that we can go on doing what we can do at minimum expense and with the greatest freedom. So it's with that kind of shame, I think. Yes, I mean, I've always been, I think it's true to say, on the left of center of things. I was born in Ireland. I was raised with narratives of the Irish Revolution in the 1920s.
Which was a violent enough affair, I suppose.
And raised with awareness of the evilness of colonialism in general, going back to Oliver Cromwell, who was the first person to colonize Ireland, and sent off. Not only did he kill thousands of Irish men and women in the cities that he besieged with the methods of medieval warfare. This is the great founder of English democracy. He also, colony number 2 is Jamaica, and he rounds up a lot of the Irish dissidents and sends them off to work as slaves in Jamaica. So before we had black slaves in Jamaica, we had white slaves, and they spoke with an Irish accent. That's the background to my predisposition to being critical. But then I got interested in the media for all kinds of reasons, and at the time I was at university as an undergraduate, and in the subsequent years, my impression, because I read The Guardian, I read The Times, I thought these are quite intelligent people. They're more intelligent than I am. I mean, they've been to Oxford, they've been to Cambridge. Some of these journalists have actually had political power. These are people you've got to take seriously. And they were telling me about the end of the British Empire. Britain magnanimously said, "Oh, dear India, please take back your country. We love you. Oh, dear Nigeria, what are we doing here? Here's your country. We're giving it back." So I grew up in this era of supposed independence, the great independence movement. And a large part of me believed it. And a large part of me thought, well, the only issues now really, it's not to do with empire anymore, but it's how quickly these wealthy Western countries can get out of the countries that they previously colonized and start allowing those countries more autonomy, more meaningful political and economic autonomy in their respective regions and in the conduct of their affairs, freedom from our foreign policy institutions, freedom from our multinational corporations, freedom in the realm of communication to produce their own messages for the rest of the world, not to be dependent on London-based Reuters or Paris-based Agence France Press or Washington-based Associated Press. These are all the institutions of imperialism. You guys need your own voices, and we need to listen to those voices. So this is the kind of liberal era atmosphere, ambiance, intellectual ambiance that I grew up with, which, by the way, was being deeply shaped by no less than the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Which was what, sorry?
The Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is the beginning of the CIA's ingress into the world of total immersion propaganda.
It's a lovely name for that.
Oh yes, you got to start doing.
It's Orwellian.
Do your research, Shane, because very few people remember these stories anymore. So here was the CIA through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, subsidizing liberal, faintly left-wing newspapers and magazines, radio stations, all manner of ways in which culturally and intellectually the CIA wanted to shape intelligent thought in the West in a direction that favored the interests of American capitalism. In the wake of that, we got the phenomenon of Operation Mockingbird. The title is sometimes disputed. Was that term ever used within the CIA? Doesn't matter whether it was used or not. But the reality is, as we know from 3 or maybe 4 different congressional inquiries in the 1970s, the Church Inquiry, Senate Investigation Committee, the Pike Inquiry, House of Representatives Committee of Inquiry, the Rockefeller Commission, can't remember whether that's Senate or House of Representatives or whatever. They're saying, what they're finding is the CIA has penetrated mainstream media in the West, generally, with their own people. Not only regular journalists are being bought, but also the owners and proprietors and senior management of some of our principal beloved media institutions are in the pocket of the CIA. And then some celebrated journalists of the period picked up on this, of course, who didn't at that time. Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame wrote a very, very famous series of articles for Rolling Stone on CIA penetration of the media. And also the Miley guy, what's his name? Seymour Hersh. Same thing.
I won't know the name.
Yeah. So this is not. Yeah, the evidence is there. And then if you want to ask yourself, well, did it stop simply because the CIA was found out or disclosed this voluntarily? No, it's never stopped. We don't have the evidence is not quite so hard, but it's there. I mean, it's so obvious to anyone who is monitoring the way in which mainstream media cover the world that there's a point at which delusion, there's a point at which ideological self-delusion has to stop. And you just have to say, no, these guys know what they're doing. They have to know what they're doing. They're just lying, either because they're paid or they're plants. They're just careerists of the most shallow kind. They don't want to upset their editors. They don't want to upset key sources. It's so well documented over so many sources. But, of course, the mainstream media are the last people to tell you any of this. But to scholars, it's more available.
So you're able to spend a considerable amount of time doing research in these directions. But for the average person, I guess we should probably wrap up. And I wanted to wrap up with an idea of how to actually approach these problems. So for the average person, how do you know, how do you draw the line between being paranoid and being critical? With this fire hose of information that's coming in, how do you know, should I spend time researching this one? Should I, because you read the title, right? And even if you don't read the article, that title is in your brain and it's molding the way you think about issues. So what is your recommendation for the way that people should approach media consumption in an environment which is filled with disinformation and misinformation?
Okay, so here's the thing. It's commonly said information is power. And we ourselves have said that in different ways during our very, very interesting conversation. And I thank you for it, Shane. It's been a really, really rewarding conversation, for me at least. So I want to say that, yes, we've said information is power, and we've looked at examples of how information is used, has been politicized for political gain. And sure, that happens. But I think the starting point here is not to have exaggerated expectations. Having the information doesn't change the world. There's nothing I can say to anybody, even if they believed it, which is unlikely. There's nothing I can say to anyone that's going to change anything. Why? Because I have no power. And most of the people who would be hearing me have no power. It's power that changes the world, not information. If you want to change the world, you have to gravitate to power. You can do that through political parties. You can maybe do it through trades associations. You might be able to do it through influential or potentially influential cultural organizations. You can do it through businesses, perhaps. If you get to control or have an influence on a major social medium, then perhaps you can begin to change the world. But you can't change the world without power. And power is not made up of information. Power is made up with the tools that are required to actually physically shape this planet. The rest is just temporary. It's just footprints in the sand that will be covered by the next wave and quickly forgotten about, however scandalous and awful it seemed at the time. It will not be remembered. I've lived long enough to know this. People don't remember it. Shit all. Change the world, you got to have power. Then you look for where the power is or where the power can be created. And you stop obsessing totally about information. Of course, you go to sensible people whose judgments you admire. And if you can, you ask them, well, where do you go? What sources do you recommend? Who do you trust to shape your information environment? And what doubts do you have? Because if you're a human being and you don't have a doubt, I worry about you.
On that note, Oliver, it was a pleasure speaking with you. I'm very glad to have had you on board here.
Thank you.
As part of the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor to talk with you, Shane, and good luck with you and with the series.
Thank you very much. Could I, in post questioning, ask you two unrelated questions? Well, semi-related. The first is, I'm just curious. You mentioned you met Gorbachev.
Oh yes.
What was he like?
Yeah. It was in a somewhat formal context. I was with a group of news agency journalists working for the Russian news agency Interfax. I was writing a history of that organization at the time because I was very interested in the development of independent media in post-Soviet Russia, and Interfax seemed to be one of the most interesting. And so they arranged for me to go to meet with Gorbachev in. He runs a charity. I can't remember the name of it now. It's housed in quite an impressive imperial mansion somewhere in Moscow. And so there I had the privilege of meeting with this historically important individual. This was about 10 years or so ago. And I think the most important thing he said to me was, It never crossed my mind in 1,000 years that the Soviet Union would ever be dismembered. That was not my intention. It was not my intention that the Communist Party should be swept from power and it should disintegrate. That was never my intention. But what happened along the way was you start making these political changes, and all kinds of toxic substances begin to seep to the surface. And in this instance, the toxic substances were right-wing nationalist discourses based on identity politics across the entirety of the former Soviet Union, who wanted nothing to do with Moscow, wanted nothing to do with the Communist Party, and that was a dam that, once broken, was very, very difficult for Gorbachev or for anybody else to block. So I think that's the one most important. But there was another slightly more human thing that I remember very much from that meeting, and it was as we were coming out of the room where this interview was taking place. I noticed a very large portrait. And I always forget her name, unfortunately, which is unforgivable, but of Gorbachev's wife, who was a very, the Western press loved her, actually. And I guess the Western press made us love her as well. She was beautiful to look at, but she was also immensely, she spoke to the people when she spoke, very sincerely and frankly. And when she was alive, she was now dead this time, you could sense, if anyone made Gorbachev, it's her. If anyone wanted real change, it was her, and she inspired you, Mikhail. And I was looking at this beautiful portrait, and just gazing at it for a few seconds, and Gorbachev is coming out of the room at the same time, and he catches my eye. He stands next to me, and he also gazes up at the portrait of her. She died of illness of some kind a few years prior, and he gazes up very wistfully. And he says, that photo was taken by an American photojournalist. And he just left it at that. But what I picked up was her importance to him.
And was there, so there was nothing behind him pointing out that it was an American?
I think
beyond.
I think he had been introduced to me as an American because I was working for an American university at that time. So I think he was simply trying to be fraternal, trying to be nice. I didn't read anything really, anything deeper in, other than perhaps he was saying, I respect you. I respect America. I respect American journalists. I respect American academics. But sad thing, the guy who had set that interview up for me, he was the founder and chair of this news agency I told you about called Interfax. It was the first non-state news agency that had ever been. He set it up under Gorbachev before the transition had occurred, and he had learned his journalistic lessons from organizations like Reuters and Associated Press and Bloomberg. He was particularly impressed by Bloomberg's ability to make money out of financial information because he saw that as the route to become the Russian version of Reuters. And that's exactly what he did. So he was very gung-ho about the West when I first met him in 2011. But then a couple of years ago, just before COVID, I had an opportunity to go, not at this time, not in a research capacity. I was teaching a course, or I was doing a couple of classes for Moscow, for a private Moscow university, Higher School of Economics, it's called. Very good institution, by the way. And so I went to see him, and he just seemed, he's like a man whose dreams and sense of self-certainty had been crushed. He could barely talk above a whisper. And he said, it happened overnight. Overnight. Well, what had happened overnight? Western media stopped trying to tell the truth. Stopped trying to tell the facts. That, in essence, he didn't use those words, but that was my interpretation. And I'll use someone else's words, because I think this is what he was saying. At that point, Western media is telling the story according to their foregone conclusion.
What prompted him to say that?
In other words, he's saying this is conclusion-driven journalism that we now have. It's not the kind of Western journalism that so impressed me when I set up Interfax back in the Gorbachev years. Yes, what prompted him to say that was I was inviting him to talk about the changed climate of international media in this space of time. With reason, because as I do further research, I realize that I can't speak for the United States, but I'm impressed by the fact that if we take Great Britain, Great Britain seems to be one of the most prolific actors in the modern propaganda networks of the world, and but if you want to trace that back, I think it's to 2014. You suddenly realize that the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office are suddenly taking propaganda way more seriously than they have in the recent past, and devoting much, much more money to it. Why? Because they think that old-fashioned weapons are no longer very important. Hegemony is achieved through information and perception. I think that's the essence of it. It's a changed philosophy, and it changes everything, and it changes their determination, because they now know. They saw how badly the West fared as a result of the 2003 invasion of Iraq on totally false pretext. They know they got to win. They got to take propaganda seriously. You can't win an information war if you say you're going to invade a sovereign country, break all the rules of international legality by invading a sovereign country and you say, well, it's because not only do they have weapons of mass destruction, but it looks like they're intending to use those weapons. Tony Blair got up in Parliament. They could use those weapons in 20 minutes. This is the kind of rubbish the Brits, with the help of Americans, of course, were spouting back at that time. And, anyone...
And this had become obvious to Gorbachev.
It had become obvious to my good friend, Mikhail Commissar, the founder of Interfax News Agency. Whether it had become obvious to Gorbachev, I don't know. We didn't talk about that particular issue. I think Gorbachev was still of a mind that... because the last time I saw him after all was before this time, was back in 2011. So he's still in the state of delusion that, the Americans do some awful things, but, by and large, they do stand for some good things. And, hey, freedom of information, wonderful thing. Democracy, a wonderful thing. But by 2014, bit by bit, people like him, and particularly, and certainly Interfax, become a great deal more skeptical about all of that, and they've only had reason to become even more skeptical in the intervening 6 or 7 years between then and as we speak now in 2021.
There's one last thing. I know your voice is probably going. But I have to ask. While I have you here, while I have the ability to ask you, Armenia, Turkey, Russia, the Karabakh crisis. Do you have any understanding of what Russia and Turkey gained in the recent conflict, or from the recent conflict?
Right. I have it partly answers this question. I have a very recent article. You'll find it on the site Dissident. I think. Oh, wait a minute. I think, yes, it was dissidentvoice.org. And I can't remember the title. It's an analysis of Turkey. Turkey is a really interesting country to be looking at right now. Really interesting. We are seeing a resurgence. I call it, well, many other people call it neo-Ottomanism. Ottomanism. This is the neo-Ottoman Empire. The empire that Ataturk thought he had put in its grave, but actually, well, Ataturk wasn't too smart either. He, like Gorbachev, he thought these Western ideals. He believed more in the ideals than in the practice. If he had thought for a moment, he would have wondered whether he was doing the right thing by overnight outlawing traditional Islamic dress and outlawing, well, basically outlawing anything that smacked of extremist Islam and all kinds of other things, and the fez, the customary Ottoman hat, all those kind of things that he did in the name of modernity. Really stupid, because we now know, as a result of the sociology and anthropology, culture doesn't work that way. Culture doesn't do what you tell it to do. Culture takes its own time and does things in its own way. And woe betide the man who thinks, like King Canute, he can sit on the border of the ocean and say, stop. That's Ataturk's failing. And so the great virtue, politically speaking, not morally, the great virtue of Erdogan is he's understood that. And he's understood the one thing that you can tap into to make Turkey great again is Islam. And also identity politics, the Turkic community, which basically connects Turkey to the Uyghurs in Western China, who are also a Turkic people who speak a language that is similar to Turkish.
What about Azerbaijan?
Right.
Are they related people?
Yes. So Azerbaijan is a Turkic people, very, very long, strong ties that connect Turkey with Azerbaijan. Armenia is principally a Christian population. Whose brothers and sisters were slaughtered in what the United States is now choosing to call the genocide of 1915 against the Armenian Turks. I put it in that language because you've got to watch the United States when it chooses to use the genocide word and when it doesn't. It doesn't choose to talk about slavery and treatment of the blacks as genocide. It doesn't choose, unless it's maybe some states will decide that treatment of Native Americans was genocide, but America doesn't. So we get very choosy and then America has decided that on the basis of virtually no evidence has decided that Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs is genocide, not simply abuse, but genocide, even though the Uyghur population is now 3 times the size as it was in year 2000. I mean, some of these things get to the point of such absurdity that you really do begin to lose faith in the power of rationality at all. Going back to Turkey, that's the heart of it. Azerbaijan lies closer to Turkish expansionist interests. Russia loses because Russia was Armenia's ally, although on this particular instance, it decided not to lift a finger of support for Armenia over the conflict of the mainly Armenian territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think Turkey wins big time. Turkey begins to think, oh, wow, this Turkic thing, it could work. If we follow this logic of Turkic ethnic ties, we'll be back to controlling half the civilized world again. Well, maybe not so civilized, but half the world anyway. Russia loses.
But so if Russia loses, why did they decide not to help an ally?
Yeah, I don't have a good question. I think probably we can find it out by going to sources that invite Russian experts to talk about these issues. And I frankly, I've not had the time. One such source, for example, is if you don't know if you know it, is the Valdai Club. It's VALDAI, and that is known to be quite a credible and important source of insight into how Russian experts and people who are Russian who are by nation, who are Russian, and you hear them talking about these kind of issues, and it affords you new insights. So I think Russia plays its cards very, very carefully. I don't think Russia is not remotely as reckless as the Americans make them out to be, or as NATO makes them out to be. I think the people who seem to be reckless are the United States and the NATO countries. They seem to fit the criteria of recklessness, not Russia.
It might have something to do with a power imbalance and who actually can be reckless and who can't be.
Es gibt Sapiens.